Doctors and therapists, do you have any no, that's not normal stories? This isn't an oddity or a habit, but I was the patient undergoing a 48-hour ambulatory EEG over the weekend. It was put out on a Friday, and I was scheduled to return on Monday. An hour or so after it was attached, I started noticing pain where all the leads were. I thought no one told me this would be so uncomfortable. I couldn't sleep all weekend, my head was aching. I couldn't get in touch with the doctor. I called the on call doctor who said that was not normal. If it becomes too intense, I should go to the ER and get it off or come in as soon as the clinic opens on Monday. I waited, paced all weekend, and kept myself occupied. Monday morning, they took it off and the leads had affected my skin. Apparently, I'm allergic to the metal on the leads and never knew. I was having an allergic reaction. They affected my skin so badly that I had to see a plastic surgeon. Also, I didn't know how much more often I cried compared to the average person. The average is 1 to 5 times a month. As a kid, up until I was a young adult, I cried an average 3 to 6 times a week. Apparently, none of my teachers, parents, therapists, or counselors noticed that it was out of the ordinary for a child to cry themselves to sleep most nights or burst into tears in the middle of class. It led to a lot of issues, and now I'm not sure I've ever been 100% depression free. I also thought it was normal to have mental breakdowns like often, like once a day or nearly daily, screaming, breaking things, disassociating, being honestly terrified of yourself and being alone, insomnia, terrible thoughts, etc. I grew out of some of it and learned how to keep most of it behind closed doors, but I still have breakdowns a couple of times a month. Some weeks, like the last few, I'll have one daily or more. It turns out that when they just rolled their eyes at my breakdowns as a kid, it might have been neglect. The first time I broke down in front of a therapist, not even a bad episode for me, she recommended hospitalization. She also quit as my therapist. Anyways, yeah, it's been getting worse again, much worse, but at least now I know it's not a normal thing people go through. Okay, so if you guys or gals find yourself going through the same things, please do get some help. As crazy as Reddit can be, I'm sure we can also find other communities here where, at the very least, we can find relatable stories that can help us cope too. Story 2. Back in August, 31-year-old me was having a checkup and my doctor asked if I had any questions before finishing up. I did and was looking forward to asking the following. This may sound weird, but for several months, every time I sneeze, my arm hurts from shoulder to finger for several minutes and then goes away. The doctor responded with, "Well, do you sneeze often? You probably have nothing to worry about. It could be a pinched nerve, but don't bother unless it gets worse." Fast forward to December. We had just finished a large office move at work, and I was getting chest pains that eventually turned into chest and arm pain when doing any sort of physical activity, even just walking to my car with my backpack. A few tests later, I found out I had 100% blockage in one artery and 71% in another. Two stents later, and I'm good as new and have a new outlook on life. Now, when I sneeze, I have no arm pain. I bitterly brought this up with my doctor, who shrugged and said, "Guess you should keep an eye on that in the future. Sounds like a good warning sign." I've since found a new doctor. Also, a few years ago, my mental health totally took a dive. As a result, I had to start a recovery program. The first thing I had to do was talk to a psychologist, and during these conversations with a psychologist, she focused on different parts of my life. One day, she'd ask about relationships, and the next, childhood memories, and so on. After a few conversations, she focused on my social life. I then told her that it's pretty much non existent and it always has been. She then stated that I must have suffered from loneliness a lot. I told her that I've never actually felt lonely at any point in my life. After all, it's pretty hard to feel lonely with the two voices in your head always keeping up a conversation. But surely she knew that, right? Well, as it turns out, no. Apparently, everybody else has their own voice in their head. My entire life has been a lie. It turns out I'm schizophrenic. Who knew, right? Pretty cool. We got a 2-for-1 in this story. The first one is watch out when you sneeze, pay a little bit closer attention to that. And second, if you hear two voices in your head, that's maybe one too many voices. Story 3. I guess I'm the patient. I had epilepsy when I was young and was put on carbamazepine. I was on it for 8 to 9 years at a very high dose. Simply put, the NHS forgot I was on it and kept prescribing me it. A doctor eventually took me off of it, and I had to wean off of it for quite a while too. The nub is that when I was young, I had an excellent memory. I could remember the minutest details. My family sometimes told me I was a memory bank. After that point, my memory became shockingly bad with entire long chunks of time just gone. For example, I did a project at work about a year ago that took a long time. Someone logged a bug in my code and I had zero memory of ever producing it. I thought it was a normal thing, just getting old. I asked someone online and the upshot was to get it checked out. My girl at the time was particularly vocal about it, demanding that my memory problems were not normal. I figured out there were times when I was doing something but had no idea what was going on but remained perfectly fine. We would have conversations and I'd have no idea what we were discussing. I'd remember events totally out of order in terms of sequence or completely wrong. For example, conversations with multiple people who couldn't possibly have been there, and lots of other things. I went for EEGs and discussed my quote unquote absences or how I usually remember things by attributing certain facts to some sort of number trick that I wasn't really conscious of. I just did it and realized that I would do things, for example, a date, and remember nothing of it. This isn't a constant, it's just random. I also get sleep paralysis and the rest of it. While this sounds horrific, it's not too bad. I have TEA, transient epileptic amnesia, but I don't view it as making life unlivable. Just sometimes I won't remember things, even with heavy prompting. I was offered a control medication, but I declined as I don't think I'm bad enough. It doesn't irritate me enough to do it. I just live by my wall calendar and a couple of notepad.txt files on my computer, and that does me fine. I'm not sure I have anything, but I also live by my calendar too. But also, anybody else getting Tyler Durden vibes from OP's story? Story 4. When I was young, I had an overbite that needed to be corrected by my orthodontist. He gave me the option to use headgear at night for a few years or to use what they call a Herbst device. After deliberating with the family, we decided I would go with the Herbst device as it would only take 1 year to correct the overbite. So I lived with this thing in my mouth for 1 year, and it sucked. Every facet of it sucked. Finally, the day came when they were to remove the device. I think anyone who's had braces can relate to the feeling of impending freedom and the excitement therein. They removed the plate and the rods, but left the palate expander in because they had not yet reached the development they were looking for. After a couple of weeks, I started to lose weight and hardly talk. I didn't want to talk because my mouth hurt. I thought it was normal after having a procedure like this. One night at dinner, my mom got frustrated by the fact that I wouldn't speak. I'd only nod, shake my head, or barely open my mouth to let an easy word or two slip out. She asked to look into my mouth and found that they never removed the screws that the rods were attached to. The ortho saw me the next day and removed them. Story 5. Not a doctor, but when I was young, I remember describing to my primary doctor how during my periods I would pass out from the pain, couldn't move, or would get sick. I told her a story about how I went on a trip to Italy and so sometimes in the middle of the flight became sick, terrifying the poor flight attendants. I used 4 bags, crawled to the back of the plane, clutching my stomach, found the doors locked, attempted to use the first class bathroom so I could finish, and when denied entry, just laid down in the aisle waiting for it to pass. I then passed out when we exited the plane. But periods are supposed to be painful, right? The doctor was like, "Honey, you're supposed to experience some discomfort, not be incapacitated." Anyway, she put me on birth control and I've never been happier. There's also this friend of mine who went through something with a guy she was involved with. They were together when he suddenly shared something about him. He said he was glad he felt like he was in his body. She gave him the weirdest look because she had no clue what he was talking about, so naturally she asked him to elaborate. He went on to explain this bizarre sensation he sometimes gets after physical contact, where he feels like he's watching himself from across the room. But this time, he didn't feel that. Instead, he felt happy. She was trying so hard not to freak out, but she couldn't help but wonder if this was normal for him. It turns out it wasn't. He mentioned it only started happening after something terrible went down 2 years ago. She had to tread carefully and gently explain that, nope, she definitely didn't get that funny feeling, and most people don't either. Then came the real challenge. She had to try and explain what disassociation was without sounding like she was diagnosing him or something. Story 6. I worked as an in-home health assessor for state insurance, and during one visit, I was in the apartment of a bedbound woman and her young son. The apartment was in an almost hopeless state with noticeable stains on the carpet. I asked if there was a leak, as I would need to notify Medicaid, who would then reach out to Section 8 for assistance. "Nah, that's where I get up and do my business, and my lazy son won't clean it up," the woman replied. I used to see this kid out and about, usually a town or two over, just walking. He had a very noticeable deformity, but he was the nicest kid for his age. However, I haven't seen him in a few years. I suspect his mom may have passed away and he got into appropriate care. Additionally, I have my own story to tell. I was in psychiatric inpatient care, which should have been my first clue, when I mentioned to the doctor seeing me that if I'm typing in the search bar, my email comes up as an auto suggestion. Even if I have no intention of trying to check my email, I begin to panic. I can't breathe, can't move, can't get a hold of my thoughts, etc. The same thing happens with just thinking about my emails, and checking emails is actually impossible for me. It can take me 2 hours just to check them, as I can only get through one or two at a time before I need a break, and that's on the days I can actually manage to check them. I finished with, "But everyone hates checking their emails, right?" intending it as a joke to lighten the tension while he was finalizing my chart. Instead, he informed me that no, not everyone hates checking their emails. He then reopened my chart, and that's how I found out I have anxiety. These two stories are incredibly eye opening. Makes you think and become more self aware, right? If you're enjoying these stories so far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Now let's dive into more medical oddities. Story 7. A guy in his 20s came in complaining of a belly button problem. I examined him and he had an irritated part inside the belly button caused by cleaning. However, the dude was sweaty and had a slight tremor. He looked like crap. When I asked how he was feeling overall, he said, "Oh, okay, I guess. Just a little tired. I drank a little more this week than usual." I had to pry for details, and it turns out he drank too much over the last 3 days and stopped drinking when he started being sick. He was totally unaware of the fact that he was going through withdrawal, sweating, and shaking, because he hadn't stopped drinking long enough in recent memory to experience symptoms. I sent him straight to the emergency room, where they found a problem in his esophagus that required immediate intervention, and he was admitted for inpatient detox. I read his hospital note. He still insisted that the ED doctor examine his belly button. I also saw a 95-year-old veteran in 5 years of remission from a kidney disease. He came in with his 72-year-old wife for a routine follow-up. She wants to know if it's safe to do it every day because she's worried about his health. Yep, 95 years old. We just said congratulations. Yes, physical relations every day are very good for your reproductive system. It keeps the flow going and helps you maintain the function for as long as possible. Use it or lose it, essentially. And it doesn't have to be with someone else either. Story 8. I was a patient, but when I went in for a routine physical, the doctor poked my extended belly and asked how long it had been like that. I laughed and said, "What? My beer belly? Oh, since I was probably 21? It turned out that no, the beer belly was a growth, and that was why my friends kept saying I looked pregnant. I thought I just had really crappy friends. I had to have emergency surgery, and for a week or so, I did not know what it actually was. It was a pretty big scare. I also have this friend who went through something really intense without realizing it wasn't normal. For years, she would uncontrollably sob for 2 weeks out of every month, and her chest hurt. Then, as soon as her period started, all these symptoms would just stop. It wasn't until she was 30 and got a female roommate that she realized this wasn't typical. She started charting her symptoms for 6 months and finally asked her OB-GYN about it. The diagnosis? PMDD, a depressive disorder tied to periods. A simple change in birth control pills fixed everything. I remember her telling me how her doctor looked at her like she was crazy for thinking this was normal for 16 years. When she asked her mom about it after the diagnosis, her mom said, "Oh yeah, remember in high school, your friends would come over and ask if you were crazy that day or not." It's wild how long she went through this without knowing it wasn't just a part of life. Alright, so how many of us fellas looked down at our quote unquote beer bellies after this story and said, "Nah, mine's for sure a legit beer belly, I just had a few beers." But on the real though, are you really so sure about that? Story 9. In therapy, we spend a lot of time normalizing behaviors people think are weird. The one big exception is psychosis, which can start out pretty low key. I was treating a patient and we were both military and in a war zone, so it wasn't terribly odd for patients to have intrusive thoughts or paranoia, depending on how they were adjusting to the job. If it weren't for some minor odd mannerisms, I might have thought he was reacting to trauma rather than feeling as though something sinister was following him around through the shadows. He was very reluctant to tell me at first, but even at the beginning of his break, he knew that was not normal. There was also this one instance where it was more like I realized what was happening was not normal, and it led to the client being diagnosed with what I can only assume was rapid cycling bipolar 2 with psychotic features. He was referred to a more appropriate agency after initial intake, so I didn't do the official diagnosis. He came in and was so down about his life that I called in another therapist to do an assessment together. Once we were going through the questions, the client became excited at having an audience and did a 180 in demeanor. I'd never experienced someone flip so quickly. Aside from the mental health stuff, the client was a really cool person whom I hoped would get proper medication and go on to live a happier life. Lots of achievable hopes and dreams, and a really intelligent person, delusions aside. Story 10. A 50-ish-year-old man who came in for chronic issue follow up. He brought his wife with him this time around. At the end of the visit, she says, "Hey, tell the doctor about that thing you can do." He turns to me proudly and tells me that he can whistle from down there. If he really pushed it, he could blow gas from it. His wife insisted it wasn't normal, but he was certain most guys could. It turns out he had a connection between his abdomen and his bladder. A mom brought her kid in because the babysitter was concerned about these spells the child would have. Apparently, the child would have episodes where he would just blankly stare at them and not acknowledge whatever it was they were telling him or whatever he was doing. The parents just thought he was being unruly, not listening to them, or being absent minded. The kid turned out to be having absence seizures. A younger gal who had come in for generalized abdominal pain that she experienced on and off for years, but just always wrote off to either cramps or bad food or life. We had asked her if she was regular, and she said yes. At some point, someone was sharp enough to ask her how often she goes to the bathroom, to which she replied, about once every 2 to 3 weeks. She had been suffering from constipation, but just thought it was normal to have BMs once to twice a month. Story 11. I was a patient. When I was growing up, I had constant stomach aches. Every time I ate, I'd get sick. I went to the doctor multiple times for it, but they could never figure out what was wrong. Eventually, I started to think that everyone lives with pain like that, and I was just being a wimp and couldn't deal with it. I barely ate and was miserable all the time. I was constantly stressed and depressed because of this problem. Fast forward to graduate school, my first year is in China. I'm there for a few months, and then over time, my symptoms disappear. I don't have stomach aches anymore. I gained about 40 pounds seemingly overnight. Now I'm at a healthy, doctor-approved weight. My depressive symptoms disappear almost entirely. But how could that have happened? What could have caused such a change? It turns out I'm lactose intolerant. I grew up in the Midwest where pretty much everything has dairy in it, and I'd been eating it constantly for so long that it took months for my system to reset. Being in China, where dairy isn't such a staple, made all the difference. I felt like such an idiot when I realized that was what was making me ill. On the plus side, I feel better, look better, and am a much happier person now. Hey, I'm lactose intolerant too, but damn it, I freaking love my milk and cheese, so I'm not sure China would be as good for me. Story 12. Not a doctor or therapist, but the patient. I have a very rare psychological disorder, and all of my therapists had no idea what to do about it or what it was. They only knew it wasn't normal. I had to travel to New York City to get diagnosed. It turns out I have clinical lycanthropy. However, while it usually presents in people with schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, no longer the proper name, but I used it for clarity, mine presents when anger and anxiety mix in such a way that my anxiety puts me in a dissociative state and the anger mixes with it. Essentially, I begin to feel and act like a wolf. It can be short lived or last for hours. Because of the way it presents, they don't have a way to treat it besides anxiety medication, but it doesn't kick in fast enough. The wolf is also male, and I am female. He was born from a traumatic childhood and is basically all of the anger and hate that I had to repress. Puberty was confusing as heck. Story 13. I was a patient. My parents rushed me to A&E because I'd taken something like 18 paracetamol tablets in less than 24 hours. I'd read stories online about people. It wasn't intentional or anything. My stomach just hurt really bad that day, and I kept falling asleep, so it was hard to keep track of time. The paracetamol barely puts a dent in my pain then. I figured this was normal pain from bad food. I got them a lot, to some extent every day, but the severity varied wildly. I figured I was just a complete wimp about normal levels of pain. I'd gone to doctors previously, but every time I'd been told that this was heartburn. A few times it was apparently because I had a test later in the week. Anyway, they did some tests and it turns out that I had a pancreatitis and I have had this same condition pretty much every time the pain got severe and I had trouble staying awake. So everyone experiences health and well-being in their own way, but better get checked out as soon as you find something super odd. Because if not, you'll join these patients over on the next video. Doctors, what made you say, how the F are you still alive? Story 2 shocked me too. See you there. Thanks for watching this one.